So I'm just going to take you through very briefly who we are, La Placa Cohen. So we are a purpose-driven organization. We're based in New York, but we work all over the US and Canada. And we work only with cultural organizations defined very broadly. So whether that's museums or theaters, foundations, botanical gardens, music festivals, you name it, we work with those organizations who are dedicated to extending the reach of culture in our world. We have been around for about 25 years, and everything that we do is helping to tell stories and ensure the impact of culture in the future. So whether that's through marketing techniques, through research, through mission development, leadership work sessions, visual identities, we're always working to help ensure the impact of culture for future generations. We work with organizations across the board. This is just a smattering, again, across education, foundations, all different types of museums, performing arts organizations. And who we are at La Placa Cohen is a whole cross-disciplinary team. So like you are yourselves, we come from a variety of backgrounds in the arts, whether professionally or because of our passion. So everything from architecture to dance to entertainment, urban planning, design, marketing and advertising. We have a number of different areas of expertise that we bring to every project, including this Culture Track study that we'll be doing. So to take you briefly through the history of Culture Track and give you a sense of where we're going with it this year. So this is our mission statement. Culture Track is a cultural innovation engine. We're dedicated to solving the most critical challenges facing the world of culture and creativity through research, education, dialogue, and action. And I'll go through that in a little bit. Grounded in the study of changing audience behavior, we help develop solutions that shape the future of culture. So this is our mission as we've articulated it, and one in which we hope to extend as we're working in Canada. Culture Track began in 2001. We had never done a study like this before, but in 2001, September 11th happened. And what happened was, especially because we're based in New York, that all of our audiences kind of lost their compass in terms of what their purpose was, how to help their audiences, how to even engage with audiences, and what emotions they were even bringing in the door. And so we had an idea to do a study, to take the temperature of those audiences, understand their motivators and barriers, and what the impact of culture was on them and on their communities, and thus how we could better help. So it began as a smaller study then, and that began where we've now fielded 7 of them. So every 2 to 3 years we field them so that we built a baseline in 2001, like we'll be doing this year with Canada, and since then have been able to track those patterns, which is part of what makes Culture Track so vital. Culture Track has impact across a variety of different channels, and it really is about collaboration. Culture Track is kind of a platform upon which it then has a broad range of impact, and the whole point of Culture Track is to help organizations chart the path forward together in ways that they could not have done on their own. We do not need to read all of these, but to give you a sense of the kind of conversations that we had after the study was released in 2014, so whether it was a keynote or part of an initial conversation at part of a staff meeting or a board meeting that then led organizations to talk about the research and then have conversations around strategic planning, summits and annual meetings of cultural organizations across many disciplines, conferences, academic guest lectures, so making sure that people, whether they're undergrads or graduate students, are understanding what's happening in the cultural world before they're released into it. Arts and cultural district presentations, so arts districts, for instance, in Denver, when they're thinking about how to build new arts districts, using this as kind of the data behind the decisions that they make. And then corporate speaker series. So this isn't just for cultural organizations. This is actually also to help corporations who are interested in social philanthropy understand what the impact of culture and hope to gain more momentum in terms of that philanthropic landscape. So those are just a smattering of those conversations we had in 2014 and after that, and we hope to have many more after this study. It also ended up engendering a lot of different projects that we worked on. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. We ended up working with Stanford University because they felt that there was a gap in the market in terms of arts education for leaders who wanted to come in and really disrupt the field. and think of something totally new. So we talk to the leaders throughout the field and across disciplines in order to develop what we call a gap analysis. What education isn't out there? What tools do arts leaders need that they aren't getting already in their day-to-day lives or in their education to be able to then go into their current organizations or to start new organizations and really enact change? This was it piloted last summer at the business school at Stanford, and it's going to start formally this summer, so we're really excited about that. This is another different type of project that we did with the Gardner Museum in Boston. I don't know if any of you have been there, but if you haven't, it's a real jewel of a museum. And this is something that, for the first time, in 2014, we both did a US national study and we did a Boston regional study. So they were able to compare the data in terms of the Boston cultural market to the national cultural market, understand the differences between the two, how Boston was kind of responding to culture differently. And then the Gardner Museum chose to do their own study with their database, so they could compare not only to the Boston market, but also to the national market and get a much better sense of where they are in the landscape. So that was a kind of a wonderful new product of Culture Track that we hope to continue in 2017. It's very exciting for Culture Track Canada to be happening now because we have been envisioning since 2014 really scaling Culture Track to be a multinational, multi-channel initiative. So for this year, we're going to have both US and Canada national studies, which is enormous, and to be able to compare the two. We're going to be doing a series of regional and deep dive studies. So although these are national studies, Ontario has signed on to do a regional study. We're in conversations with the Bay Area and with Los Angeles and with Kansas City and a lot of other both cities and regions within the US thinking about doing market or region-specific studies that will be able to be compared to the national studies. And then deep dives are, obviously for a national study, we can't go that deep in any one topic. This is really setting a baseline, and especially for Canada, it's the first of its kind, so it will set the baseline for studies moving forward. But if there are topics such as diversity or loyalty that we want to get into more deeply, we're hoping to have a series of deep dive studies that gets into those topics a little bit more. In addition to the studies, as I mentioned before, Culture Track, we really hope is a platform upon which there's education and conferences and talks and cross-disciplinary conversations that help to, research is only useful if you can help put it into action, and it's going to be all of you around here working all together to think about what to do once we get the results of this and what it means for everybody. So I think that's where the education workshops, talks, and panels come in. And then 5 key trends. So we're just going to take you through a few trends that came out of 2014 that will help, that we're going to go further into in 2017, and then we'll have a Q&A to get a sense of what your questions are. Turn it over to my colleague, Hill.
All right, thank you, Maggie. So as Maggie mentioned, we just want to take you through a bit of kind of the top line data that came out of 2014. You know, I know many of you were in the room when Arthur spoke last time, but I know some of you weren't. And this also just puts a little detail around what type of data will come out of a study like this, and what kind of stories will we be able to pull from that data. So the first key trend, and perhaps kind of the top line key trend that really came out of our 2014 study, was about this fundamentally evolving definition of culture. So for the first time in the 2014 study, we asked the audience, you know, what activities do you define as culture? And once we figured that out, what are you participating in? And the results were really, really fascinating. So what you're going to see here, these numbers are the rate of participation by audiences in activities that more than half of them define as culture. So we have a lot of kind of sectors and categories here that are probably not surprising that audiences define them as culture, right? We have museums with a 60% attendance rate. We have classical music with a 54% attendance rate. But then there were these really interesting ones that popped up. We have food and drink experiences that most people are defining as culture, and that was actually particularly driven by millennials. Non-commercial television, like Downton Abbey, right? Overwhelming rates of participation, but people are also defining that as culture. And so what that meant, at least in the US landscape, is that on the one hand, it can seem a little scary, right? Because it means that your competitive landscape has all of a sudden broadened, and it includes Netflix, and it includes food trucks, right? But there is a flip side to this that we are really actually excited by, which is that it means people are more culturally active than they've ever been before, right? The appetite for culture is huge. They're just thinking about it in ways that are a little different than we've seen before, a bit more expansive. So it'll be very interesting to see how this comes to bear in Canada. The second trend, perhaps unsurprising, social media, right, has completely revolutionized the way that people are consuming information about culture, and technology as a whole has radically changed the way that people are both consuming information about culture and also engaging with cultural experiences. And I know there have been a number of really interesting thoughts about that already this morning. But in terms of social media particularly, this has completely changed the way that people are actually learning about cultural activities. So for millennials, we've been tracking information sources for culture for a long time. We've always seen that the more traditional media sources like newspapers, like magazines always rise to the top. But in 2014, for millennials, social media is number one, right? So we have to be sure that we are reaching out to audiences through those channels. Shifting motivators, really at the heart of the culture track study is motivators and barriers. So not just the what of cultural participation, but really the why, right? What's in the hearts and minds of these people. And what we found in 2014 is that they had just become a little more nuanced than they had ever been before, like a little more distinct. And just to give you a taste of that, 2/3 of audiences said that they were seeking out culture to escape stress. Right? That was a significant driver for them to attend a cultural activity. And this is actually a multifaceted point, I think. On the surface, it can sound like people just want to go and, say, take a yoga class in an art gallery, right? And not to say that that's not amazing, because those are great programs. But for those of us who work in cultural industries that perhaps have a little bit heavier or more serious content, this doesn't just have to be about allowing people to kind of zen out. It can also be about providing the hospitality that really makes them feel welcome, right? Great wayfinding that lowers their stress of trying to figure out where they're going, or just really having a smiling face at the door. And barriers as well are just as nuanced as the motivators that are on the flip side. And if audiences find that their needs are not met, they're not going to come. And so one very particular finding in terms of barriers, nearly 4 in 5 audiences will not go to a cultural activity if they can't find someone to go with, right? So they are fundamentally social, and it is a serious barrier if they either can't convince someone to go with them or don't feel like they're attending an event where that type of behavior or coming with friends is really a positive in that case. And finally, this was another one of our big findings from 2014, what we started to call cultural promiscuity, that audiences are just way harder to pin down and keep loyal than they ever were before. This manifested itself in a couple of different ways. First, in museum memberships. In 2011, we saw that over a quarter of audiences held a museum membership. In 2014, that number was down to 15%. Right? So that is a drastic shift. Theaters actually were even more significant. So 23% of audiences in 2011 holding a subscription, down to 10% in 2014. And our thought on this is that this is a call for a totally new model, right? That you can look, it's very easy, I think, for organizations to say that loyalty is gone, right? And just that people are so kind of hyper-connected and flighty that you can't pin them down. But the truth is, you look around, you see people with their iPhones, right? You see people with brands that they are really, really loyal to. So that behavior exists, and the question is how we as cultural organizations can really figure out how to adjust this changing trend. So again, I think this in particular will be interesting both to see where this projects in the US in 2017, but also to see kind of what this emerging trend will be in Canada as well, because it's definitely a pressing issue. So hopefully that gives you just a taste of some of the issues that might emerge from this study. And with that, I will pass off to my colleague Phil, who will take you through a bit more specifics on the Canada study itself.
Thank you, Hill. So we want to be really clear, as Maggie and Hill said, that we really grade Culture Track Canada's success on the impact we make, both for organizations and for audiences directly. So as many people have already said today, we really see ourselves as partners with Business for the Arts, with you all, and with Nick Nanos from Nanos Research. And we want to build on the impact we've already made in the US the past 15 years. We're aware that Culture Track Canada does not exist in a vacuum. We see ourselves really adding to the already rich legacy of audience research that's being done in this country, both in the past and things that's been going on right now. So we want to figure out how do we fill the gaps to make sure all organizations have a really comprehensive array of data at their disposal. So what makes Culture Track Canada different? And we think there are four things that we bring value to. The first is that we are totally free and open source. So the data, after it's fielded, is completely free and accessible to everyone in this room, every organization and audience across Canada, and that includes the raw data as well. We're collaborative and cross-disciplinary, so as Maggie already said, that we really see Culture Track as the spark for further conversations, both people between art museums and theaters, people getting in the room who sometimes haven't been in the room together before and discussing what these results mean to everyone. This is the first tracking study of Culture Track in Canada, and that's a big one for us. We see this as kind of the first in a long journey of tracking audiences in the way that we think will be really valuable to cultural organizations. So we're, as Maggie said, setting a baseline for further study that, like the US, we have this long history of 15 years of audience data, and we hope to have that in Canada too. And finally, we want to be comparable to the US and to other markets. So how do we do that? It's through this common questionnaire, like Nicole mentioned, that we can be able to compare Canadian data to US data, local markets, the national study. We see this as a really interesting way for organizations from the grassroots level to even large ones be able to relate their audiences to audiences nationwide and vice versa. So just want to take a second to talk about methodology very briefly. Nick, do you want to come up here and just speak to this?
Sure. Hopefully I can read. Yes, I can read the slide from this side, so could you just...
Yeah, I'll go through them all.
Okay, so before I start, I'd just like to say that, to kind of sum up everything, this is a great project, period. This is going to be a transformative project for you. The methodology and approach that LaPlaca-Cohen has is tried and true. I've taken a look at it. It's excellent. You know, you have to realize that Canada is going to benefit from the depth and breadth of experience at LaPlaca-Cohen to kind of have a solution for ourselves, but to also have, as Phil said, kind of a collaborative. You know, when I think of this project, you know, think of it this way. You know, Phil talked about the data, and just to kind of reiterate what he said about the data is that the individual survey responses that we collect will be stripped of unique identifiers, the 4,000 to 5,000 interviews, and then anyone will be able to take the data and, you know, what I would say, you know, and to use it and to do their own analysis. You know, the reality is, so you will be able to kind of, and this is very appropriate for, I'll say it, the cultural family, because really it is creative, right? It will be collaborative, and it will have a significant contribution. So, you know, I'm very excited because most of the studies that we do I don't want to say are secretive, but they're very proprietary. No one shares the data. No one even shares the base data. So think of opening this up, even for our friends from the United Kingdom who might be interested in looking at and crunching the Canadian data. And I think that's one of the key benefits here, that there will be kind of market intelligence and consumer insights that you will be able to create and curate after this study is done in terms of slicing and dicing the data by millennials, by seniors, by people that live in small communities, that people that live in the country, and then people live downtown. And when we look at the methodology that we're going to be using for this particular project, we're going to be having 4,000 respondents. We're going to be having quotas for each province, which means we'll be doing oversamples. So there will be quotas in each province so that we can have a fairly reasonably robust sample by each province. And then Ontario has opted to top up because of the diversity in Ontario, the geographic diversity and ethnic diversity in Ontario. They've topped up, so they're going to be doing a oversample. They'll have 1,000 interviews in Ontario because they want to know the difference between what's happening at Yonge and Bloor and then what's happening in Northern Ontario. And, you know, the interesting thing about the project is, you know, there'll be data for Northern Ontario, and then if you're in Northern Manitoba, you'll be able to take those numbers and see what's happening just across the border with many of our kind of colleagues in Ontario that share many similar challenges related to culture. The screener, which has been developed by LaPlaca-Cohen, is actually quite in-depth, and it screens for cultural inclination, broadly defined. So it includes two fundamental elements. It has a list of potential activities, and then for people to be screened in, they need to believe or associate that that particular activity is a cultural activity. So those two criteria need to be met in order to focus on the target audience. We'll be using an online survey methodology so that it will be directly comparable to the US, because that's what they've used at La Placa Cohen over the years, and they have found it successful. And it's very important for the data to be comparable. And of course, it'll be a bilingual questionnaire that will be administered in both French and English. So that's it. Back to you, Phil.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thanks, Nick. So I hope that was helpful. For our last part, we just want to briefly go through the 7 themes that we're already playing with for Culture Track Canada. These themes were built from the US questionnaire. So again, we really want to be able to compare the Canadian data to the US data, but this is not set in stone. We had a great discussion last evening about how do we kind of maximize this questionnaire for the Canadian market, but just want to give you a taste right now. But no, this is all in flux right now, and for the next few months, we're going to make sure this is really reflective of the Canadian market. So the first is following the patterns of cultural consumption. This is just kind of the nuts and bolts data that everyone wants to know. Frequency, participation, saliency, those types of things that are so important for tracking to know who is coming to cultural activities and experiences. Engaging diverse audiences. This is all about how arming cultural organizations with the data they need to know how to attract new audiences and diverse audiences. So thinking about things like inclusion, hospitality, welcome, barriers to entry. Designing the ideal cultural experience. What are the kinds of cultural experiences and aspects of cultural experience that audiences are really yearning for that don't exist right now? Whether they're social, digital, immersive, whatever it might be, those are the kind of things that we'll be asking questions about. Loyalty, this is what Hill spoke to, is what are the questions and kind of loyalty behaviors that we need to take notice of that audiences are already doing, usually outside of culture, so we can give organizations the data to kind of create new models, new affinity models to reach audiences. Digital strategy, this is a huge one for everyone. How are audiences conceiving of digital tools in cultural spaces? How are they using digital tools just in their daily lives? And what kind of digital experiences are they wanting in their cultural spaces? Demystifying the changing philanthropic landscape. So this is talking about giving behaviors, how much people are giving to how many organizations, to what organizations, and most importantly, what are the motivators for giving to cultural organizations? And the last one is articulating the impact of culture, and this is a big one for us as well. This is all about how can we best define what people believe is the impact of cultural experiences, whether it brings people together, it educates me, there's economic impact. Those are the kind of things that we'll be asking questions about to help organizations understand what is their impact on audiences.